The desert wind howled through the cracks of the old wooden saloon doors inside. Smoke curled toward the oil lamps, mingling with the stench of whiskey and cheap laughter. On a rickety wooden platform, a lone woman stood, her dark eyes fierce, but a flicker of fear hid in their depths. Below, rough men tossed out numbers, bidding on her life like she was a horse at auction. Then, $100, a single gold coin slammed onto the table. The metallic ring cut through the room like a gunshot. The laughter died. Cards froze midair. Every head turned toward the shadow in the corner, a man who hadn't spoken to another soul in months. No one knew it yet, but his choice tonight would change two lives forever. Gideon Hale had spent most of his adult life living on the edges of the world, where the desert swallowed the horizon and the wind carried more conversation than men ever did. His home, Iron Mesa Ranch, sat nearly 40 miles from the nearest sign of civilization, and that was just how he preferred it. Out there, the world was honest. The desert didn't lie. It didn't scheme or betray. It simply existed, raw and unforgiving, and demanded that a man either bend to its will or break beneath its sun. Gideon had long ago decided to bend, and in doing so, he had built a life that suited his scarred soul. Morning on the ranch came with the sharp whistle of dry wind across the canyon, the clatter of loose tin roofing, and the low bellow of restless cattle. Sometimes the only other living creature he saw for days was his old gray horse, Bramble, whose ears twitched at the faintest echo of coyotes prowling the hills at night. Gideon liked it that way, or at least that's what he told himself. In truth, the silence was both his sanctuary and his prison. He had fought in a war that chewed men up and spit them out, and he carried the echoes of it in his bones. He had witnessed friends fall to the mud and smoke of battlefields with pleas for their mothers on their lips, and he'd sworn when the fighting was over that he would never again let the world claim a piece of his heart. So he built fences, he mended roofs, he drove cattle, he let the years strip away any softness he once had. 15 years passed like that, sunrise to sunset, fence post to fence post, the days marked not by calendars but by the color of the sky at dusk and the taste of dust in his teeth. He rarely went into town. When he did, it was for flour, salt, or the occasional tin of coffee, never for company. People carried trouble in their pockets and poison in their tongues. But on this particular day, the Arizona sun had cooked his patience down to nothing, and the thirst in his throat demanded relief. He had spent 3 days under the unrelenting heat, mending a section of fence that had splintered in a summer storm. By the time he swung into his saddle and pointed Bramble toward town, the only thought in his head was of a glass of whiskey cold enough to bite. The ride into town was long and lonely, the trail a ribbon of red dust cutting through the scrub and rock. Sagebrush and brittle cactus lined the edges, and every so often a vulture circled overhead, as if reminding him of the desert's appetite. The air smelled of heat and stone, and the silence was broken only by the creak of leather straps and the soft clink of spurs against his boots. By the time the crooked buildings of Red Bluff appeared on the horizon, the sun was sliding westward, painting the desert in hues of golden blood. A few children darted across the dirt road, their laughter sharp and fleeting in the dry air. A mangy dog slept under the shade of a water trough, and the blacksmith's hammer rang in uneven rhythm somewhere down the street. Gideon guided Bramble to the hitching post outside Silas Traeger's saloon, the largest and loudest building in the tiny frontier town. Its swinging doors creaked with every burst of sound from within. Laughter, a piano stumbling over a jaunty tune, the occasional curse tossed over a poker hand. The smell hit him first: sweat, tobacco, spilled whiskey, and the faint sourness of old beer soaked into the floorboards. He tied his horse and stepped inside, his spurs clicking against the wooden porch. The shift from the blinding sun to the dim, smoky interior was like stepping into another world. Shadows clung to the corners, oil lamps threw patchy halos of amber light, and the haze of cigar smoke made every movement seem to swim. Gideon made for the bar, intending only to wet his throat and leave before anyone remembered his name. The bartender, a wiry man with sleeves rolled to the elbow, gave him a nod and slid a bottle his way without a word. Gideon appreciated that. Silence was its own language. But just as he lifted the glass to his lips, A voice cut through the saloon like a knife through cloth, rough, sharp, and meant to be heard. Lot 17, young, good teeth, can read and write. Bidding starts at $50. The words hung in the air, strange and out of place, before settling over the room like a storm cloud. Gideon paused, the whiskey hovering just shy of his lips. He had come for quiet, for a moment to drown out the desert in amber and glass. Instead, he found himself at the edge of a story he hadn't asked for and couldn't walk away from. The saloon moments ago, a hive of drunken laughter and clinking glasses, fell into a tense, greedy hush. Even the piano player let his fingers hover above the keys, waiting. Gideon Hale felt the shift in the air, a predator's stillness, and turned his gaze toward the source of the auctioneer's voice. There she was, Amara Vance. She stood on a makeshift wooden platform, no higher than a pair of crates nailed together. Yet it might as well have been a gallows. Oil lamps cast a wavering amber glow across her skin, turning the deep brown of her face and arms into polished bronze against the gloom. The blue dress she wore was faded and threadbare. The hem frayed from too many miles walked on too little hope. And yet the way she held herself, the straightened spine, the squared shoulders, spoke of a woman who refused to be broken, even under the weight of 100 hostile eyes. Around her, the saloon breathed hunger. Ranch hands, card sharks, and whiskey-swollen drifters leaned forward from their stools. Coins jingled in their palms. A fat man in a dusty bowler hat licked his lips. The smell of tobacco and sweat thickened, mingling with the sour tang of spilled whiskey, turning the air into something alive and watching. And then there were her eyes. They were sharp as tempered steel. They did not plead. They did not soften. They dared the room to see her as a person, not a prize. For a heartbeat, Gideon felt the old battlefield ghosts stir inside his chest. He had seen that look before, not in a saloon but in the mud of war, in the eyes of young soldiers cornered and outnumbered, refusing to surrender even as death crouched close. That same fierce defiance now lived in Amara's gaze. The auctioneer, a stringy man with a voice like a rasp, circulated the room, waving one arm like a preacher. Lot 17. Young, good teeth, can read and write. She'll fetch water, clean your home, teach your children. Who'll start me at 50? The first bid came from the fat man. 50, he barked as if claiming a piece of furniture. Another voice from the back, rough and amused, called out, 60. She looks sturdy enough to last the winter. The room chuckled, coins jingling like tiny bells of greed. Amara's chin lifted a fraction higher. Her fingers trembled once against her faded blue dress. Just once. Gideon's jaw tightened. Memories of the battlefield rose unbidden. Boys with tear-streaked faces refusing to yield. The weight of promises made to himself after the war. He felt his heart hammering as the bidding crept higher. 70, 75, 80. Each number struck him like a drumbeat, each laugh like a dare. The desert silence he'd lived in for 15 years pressed hard against his chest. And then her eyes found his again. A flicker of fear, a flame of defiance. In that moment, Gideon Hale knew, if no one else will stand for her, I will. Gideon's heart pounded as the bidding reached $80. He hesitated only a moment, then pushed back his chair, the screech of wood against wood loud enough to make half the room flinch. For a moment, Gideon's hand hovered over his coins. Images flashed, muddy trenches, the choking smoke of Shiloh, a young soldier's hand gripping his coat before slipping into stillness. He had sworn under that blood-red sky that he would never let the world pull him back into its ugliness. Yet here it was, staring at him from a rickety wooden platform. The saloon's smoke and whispers blurred into the same hum he remembered on the battlefield, that edge of life silence before a man chose to act, or to turn away forever. He rose to his full height, a lone figure framed by shadow and lamplight, and stepped forward. His boots thudded against the floorboards, each step echoing like a drumbeat of resolve. Without a word, he reached into his pouch, feeling the cold bite of silver coins. Then, with a voice steady as a winter wind, he said, $100. The words cut through the saloon like a bullet through glass. The laughter stopped. The piano went silent. Even the drifting smoke seemed to pause midair. All heads turned toward him. The hermit rancher, the man who had spent 15 years avoiding the world, now standing in the middle of it, staking his claim for a stranger. The silver dollars clinked onto the table with a metallic ring, sharp and final. In that sound, Gideon Hale's quiet world shattered. There was no going back. The saloon stayed frozen in that long, echoing moment after Gideon Hale's bid. The silver dollars lay on the table, glinting under the weak light of the oil lamps. Every man in the room stared at them like they'd heard a gunshot. Then slowly, Silas Traeger smiled. It wasn't the friendly smile of a saloon keeper. It was the coiled grin of a rattlesnake, all teeth and quiet menace. He sauntered forward from behind the bar, his boots thumping against the floorboards. "Well, well, and Gideon Hale," he drawled, his voice smooth and oily. "Didn't think the desert ghost had a soft spot for the ladies. Or maybe you just like expensive souvenirs." Laughter rippled through the room, but it carried a nervous edge. Everyone knew Silas. He didn't let anyone walk out richer or braver than him without a cost. The auctioneer looked ready to hand Amara over, but Silas raised a hand to stop him. His smile widened. "I think we got ourselves a complication." The room went quiet again. "See, Mr. Hale," Silas continued, pacing slowly like a cat toying with its prey. "It just occurred to me. Miss Vance here ain't exactly free to go. Matter of law, you understand." Gideon's eyes narrowed. "What law?" Silas leaned close, voice dropping to a serpent's whisper that somehow carried across the room. "She killed a man. Not just any man. The mayor's son. They've been looking for her for weeks. Self-defense, she says. Law won't care." A ripple of murmurs ran through the saloon. Even the drunkest gambler sobered a little at that. Everyone knew what a black woman accused of killing a white man faced in 1885 Arizona. Gideon's gut turned cold, but he didn't flinch. He looked at Amara. She didn't look away. Her chin was high, her eyes steady, but he saw a flash of fear before she buried it again. Silas's grin returned. "So here's the deal, Hale. You want her? She's gonna cost you more than a measly $100, $500 cash. Or..." He let the word hang in the smoke, inviting greed to settle into every corner. "You walk away, and I forget this ever happened." $500. The number hit Gideon like a physical blow. It was 2 years of sweat and blood, every fence post, every blister. It was the future of Iron Mesa Ranch. The breeding stock, the repairs, the winter feed. The room waited. Men leaned closer. Breath held. Gideon felt his pulse pound in his ears. A dozen reasons to leave clawed at him. This wasn't his fight. He'd built his life on staying clear of trouble. Walking away would cost him nothing but a night's sleep. And yet, as he stood there, the desert silence he loved so much pressed against his heart. If he left her, he knew that silence would turn into something else entirely. Emptiness that would haunt him. Slowly, Gideon shook his head. "I don't have 500. Silas smirked, already turning to claim his prize. "Then I guess this auction's over. Gentlemen, wait." The single word cut through the saloon like a whip crack. Gideon reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a folded, weathered piece of paper, creased and worn soft from years of living in his coat. He held it up between 2 fingers. "I got something better." Silas paused, suspicious. "And what might that be?" Gideon unfolded the paper, slow and deliberate. The deed to Iron Mesa Ranch. 4,700 acres. Water rights, cabin and corrals. Every inch I bled for since the war. The room went dead silent. Even the smoke seemed to hesitate. Silas's eyes widened, then narrowed in calculating hunger. "You'd give up your ranch for her?" Gideon's voice was low and iron steady. "I would." A collective murmur rippled through the saloon. Some men shook their heads in disbelief. Others leaned back, suddenly aware they were witnessing the kind of choice that changes a man's life forever. Amara's lips parted, her composure cracking just enough to let shock and something else, hope, flicker through. In that moment, the die was cast. Gideon Hale had placed everything he owned, everything he was, on the line for a woman the world had thrown away. And there was no turning back. For a moment, it seemed the saloon itself had forgotten how to breathe. The offer was made, The ranch deed rested in Gideon Hale's calloused hand, and every man in the room could smell the weight of that gamble. And then Amara Vance moved. Slowly, deliberately, she reached into the folds of her worn blue dress and pulled out something small, a leather-bound journal, its cover scuffed and edges frayed. She held it up, her voice steady as steel. "You want to talk about law, Silas Traeger? Let's talk about your law." A ripple ran through the room. The journal seemed to hum with danger. Amara opened it to a page filled with neat handwriting and numbers and began to read aloud. February 14th, 2 stolen horses sold to Deputy Harlan. March 3rd, Ella Price, 17 years old, last seen walking up your back stairs. June 28th, 3 men robbed on the Red Bluff Trail. All under your watch, Mr. Traeger. The saloon stirred. Chairs creaked. A few men who had been leaning forward in excitement now shifted uncomfortably. Amara's voice grew louder, cutting through the haze of smoke. 3 years of names, dates, crimes. Every girl who disappeared from the saloon, every body that turned up in Devil's Canyon, all written down, all ready for the federal marshals. Silas Traeger's grin faltered. His hand twitched toward his gun, but he stopped himself. He knew the weight of those words. "You're bluffing," he said, though his voice was less certain now. Amara hugged the journal to her chest, eyes burning. "There are 3 copies. If I don't send word every week, they go straight to the marshals. Your empire dies whether I live or not." The room shifted. Men who had once cheered for the auction now stared at Silas with suspicion, whispers hissing through the crowd like wind through dead grass. A few slid back toward the doors. No one liked standing next to a man whose sins were suddenly visible. Silas's calm cracked. His voice rose to a snarl. "Enough!" He jerked his chin to his hired muscle. 2 men, big, mean, with gun hands itching, started forward. The air snapped tight. That was the moment the first shot rang out. No one saw who fired first, but the blast shattered the stillness. The saloon erupted into chaos. A bullet tore through the leg of a chair, inches from Amara's face. Gideon caught the edge of her arm and yanked her down, just as a second shot shattered the oil lamp overhead, raining hot glass onto the floorboards. The saloon had turned into a coffin of smoke and fire, and Gideon moved like a man who had walked through hell before. Wood splintered under stray bullets. The piano gave a strangled note as a slug buried in its frame, and the thick smell of gunpowder mixed with spilled whiskey until the air burned in their lungs. Somewhere a man screamed, a high, panicked sound, before diving for cover. Pistols flashed in the smoky lamplight. Glass shattered as bottles exploded behind the bar. Men dove for cover, flipping tables and overturning chairs. Gideon Hale was already moving, drawing his Colt with the speed of a rattlesnake strike. He shoved Amara behind a heavy oak table as bullets chewed splinters into the air. The piano player dove to the floor. Someone screamed. The air smelled of gunpowder and whiskey, thick and acrid. Silas tried to run for the back door, journal in hand, but Gideon moved through the chaos like a man possessed. He slammed an elbow into a thug's jaw, ducked behind an overturned card table, and fired 2 precise shots that sent Silas's second gunman crashing into a wall of liquor bottles. Amara stayed low, her hands gripping the journal tight against her chest. Her heart pounded, but her eyes never wavered. She had started this fight with words. Now Gideon was finishing it with steel. The battle inside the saloon was short and vicious, the kind of violence that leaves a permanent echo in the air. When the smoke cleared, a few men had fled out the swinging doors, and the rest lay moaning on the floor or crouched in corners, hands raised. Silas Traeger was gone, vanished through the back. Journal clutched like a lifeline. Gideon turned to Amara, his chest heaving, and gave a single nod. They both knew. The fight wasn't over. It had only moved to the empty, moonlit street outside. The night air outside Silas Traeger's saloon was sharp with desert chill, a stark contrast to the heat and smoke left behind inside. The town of Red Bluff lay silent under the silver wash of moonlight, its dirt street littered with broken glass and the drifting echo of gunfire. Gideon Hale stepped through the swinging doors first, boots crunching on the dry earth, his Colt heavy in his hand. Amara Vance followed, the leather-bound journal clutched tightly to her chest, her torn blue dress fluttering in the night breeze. The chaos of the saloon was already fading behind them, replaced by an eerie stillness that often followed violence. Across the street, a figure stumbled into view. Silas Traeger, face pale with rage and desperation, the journal still in his grip. His hat was gone, his shirt soaked with sweat and whiskey. He held a Smith & Wesson revolver in his free hand, the barrel catching a shard of moonlight. "Should have walked away, Hale," Silas hissed, his voice ragged. "You'll die here, same as her." Gideon didn't raise his gun yet. He took a slow step forward, his voice steady as stone. "It's over, Silas. The room heard everything. That journal's your noose." Before Silas could reply, the clatter of hooves broke the stillness. Down the street, a wagon with the seal of the federal marshals rolled into view, flanked by two riders. At its head was Marshal Everett Boone, a tall, weathered man whose very presence carried the weight of law. His eyes scanned the scene in an instant, taking in the broken windows, the armed men, and the journal clutched in Silas's trembling hand. "Silas Traeger," Boone's voice boomed, echoing off the wooden facades. "You're under arrest for theft, murder, and obstruction of federal justice. Drop the weapon." For a heartbeat, Gideon thought Silas might comply. But the saloon owner's pride was a venom that wouldn't let go. With a snarl, he snapped his revolver toward Gideon, finger tightening on the trigger. The shot never came. Marshal Boone's rifle cracked like thunder. Silas staggered back, dropping his gun into the dirt. The journal tumbled from his grasp, its pages fanning open as he collapsed to his knees. A deputy rushed forward, cuffs clinking in the moonlight, and Silas Traeger's reign over Red Bluff ended with a whimper. Gideon exhaled, tension leaving his shoulders in a long, heavy sigh. Around them, townsfolk began to peek from doorways, their whispers carried on the night wind. They had witnessed a chapter of history closing, the fall of a man who had ruled by fear, and the rise of two strangers who refused to look away from injustice. Amara approached Gideon, the journal now secure in Marshal Boone's hands. Her eyes, dark and steady, softened for the first time that night. She placed a hand on his forearm, her voice quiet but firm. "You offered me freedom tonight, Gideon Hale. You didn't have to, but you did." Gideon looked down at her hand, then at the endless desert beyond the town. His ranch, his entire life's work, was gone, traded for a choice he couldn't take back. Yet strangely, his chest felt lighter than it had in 15 years. "Some things are worth more than land," he said simply. They stood together under the wide Arizona sky, stars scattered like shards of glass across black velvet. The wind carried away the last wisps of smoke from the saloon. For the first time in years, Gideon felt the desert's silence, not as a prison, but as a promise. Amara gave a small, almost shy smile. "Maybe. A man like you could use a partner, someone who knows how to fight in her own way." Gideon met her gaze and nodded once, a quiet agreement passing between them. Whatever the future held, new land, new fences, or just the long road ahead, they would face it side by side. As the marshal's wagon rolled away with Silas in chains, Red Bluff returned to its usual quiet. But for Gideon Hale and Amara Vance, nothing would ever be quiet in the same way again. By the time the marshal's wagon disappeared down the trail, the horizon had begun to pale. The first light of dawn brushed the desert in silver and rose. Gideon and Amara stood in the street, side by side, watching the night surrender to morning. Neither spoke. The wind carried only the soft rattle of a shutter and the distant clop of retreating hooves. For the first time in 15 years, Gideon felt the sun rise, not on a life of solitude, but on a road he would no longer walk alone. Amara's shoulder brushed his, a quiet promise without words, and he let the moment settle in his chest like a new heartbeat. Stories like this one remind us that courage doesn't always look like gunfights or grand gestures. It can be as simple as choosing to act when it would be easier to walk away. Gideon Hale's choice to risk everything for Amara Vance wasn't just about the Old West. It reflects a timeless truth. Our character is revealed by how we respond to the suffering of others. In today's world, we face different kinds of crossroads. Maybe it's standing up for someone being treated unfairly, speaking up when silence feels safer, or lending a hand to a neighbor in need. Doing the right thing can still come with a cost, but as Gideon learned, the cost of inaction can be far heavier on the heart. I'd like to leave you with a question. If you were in Gideon's boots today, would you step in for a stranger, even if it risked your comfort, your reputation, or your peace? Or would you turn away and try to forget? Share your thoughts in the comments. I truly want to hear your perspective. Stories like this only live on when we reflect together and pass on their lessons. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the frontier. If this story moved you, inspired you, or gave you something to think about, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who might need a reminder of the courage still inside all of us.